The day my brother stood at the head of the table and announced he was taking over my grandfather's hardware business. He was holding a glass of champagne and smiling like he'd already won. I was standing near the kitchen doorway, still holding a dish towel, and I remember thinking, nobody even looked at me. My name is Cassie Harmon. I was 34 years old that afternoon, and I had worked inside that store for 11 years. Let me back up. My grandfather, Raymond Harmon, built Harmon's Hardware from nothing. He opened the original location in Dayton, Ohio, in 1981, with a small business loan and a handshake deal on a lease. By the time I was old enough to visit him after school, the store had expanded twice and employed 9 full-time staff. Grandpa Raymond was the kind of man who remembered every customer's name, kept handwritten notes on repair projects people brought in, and never locked the front door exactly at closing time if someone still needed help. He was also the kind of man who watched quietly. He didn't say much at family dinners. He didn't argue. He just paid attention. I didn't fully understand that about him until much later. Growing up, the difference between my brother and me was never subtle. My brother's name is Curtis, and from the time he was about 15, our parents treated him like he was already the head of something. Curtis got the car at 16. Curtis got the bigger college fund. When Curtis dropped out of his business degree after 2 semesters, my parents called it a gap year and didn't bring it up again. When I graduated with my accounting degree, my mother asked me at dinner whether I was planning to settle down soon. I wasn't bitter about it then. Or maybe I was, and I just didn't have the words for it yet. What I did instead of being bitter was work. I started helping at Grandpa's store part-time when I was 23, right after graduation. I did the books. I caught a vendor overcharging us for 3 years and renegotiated the contract. I built out an inventory tracking system that cut waste by almost a fifth in the first year. Grandpa noticed. He never made a big deal of it, but every time I showed him a spreadsheet or walked him through a quarterly report, he'd nod slowly and say, "Good eye, Cassie, good eye." Curtis showed up at the store occasionally. He'd work the register for a few weeks, charm the customers, then disappear for a few months. Once he convinced Grandpa to let him handle a supplier negotiation and came back with a deal that cost us more than the original contract. Grandpa fixed it quietly and never embarrassed Curtis about it. That was Grandpa's way. He didn't correct people in public. He just watched them show him who they were. When Grandpa's health started declining, my parents began having conversations around him like he couldn't hear. I caught pieces of them at Thanksgiving, at Easter, in parking lots after Sunday dinners. The business would go to Curtis. It made sense. Curtis was the only grandson. Curtis had that personality, that energy, that presence. Who was going to walk into Harmon's Hardware and trust a woman behind the counter? That last part was said by my uncle, not my parents. But nobody's disagreed. I kept showing up. I kept doing the books. I drove Grandpa to his cardiology appointments when my parents were busy and sat with him in the waiting room while he did the crossword puzzle from a newspaper he'd brought from home. On the drive back, he'd sometimes ask me about the store, about vendor relationships, about whether I thought we should expand the tool rental section. Once, he asked me what I would do if I ever had to run the whole thing myself. I told him honestly. I said I'd probably be scared, but I'd figure it out. He folded his newspaper and looked out the window for a while without saying anything. I didn't think much of it at the time. Grandpa Raymond passed away in March on a Tuesday morning, quietly at home. He was 81. The store closed for 3 days. His longtime employees, some of whom had worked there for 15 or 20 years, came to the service and stood in the back row. A week after the funeral, my parents called a family dinner. They framed it as a celebration of Grandpa's life and a chance to talk about the future of the business. My mother made his favorite pot roast. Curtis showed up in a new jacket. I noticed, when I arrived, that Grandpa's longtime attorney, a man named Mr. Sheehan, was sitting at the far end of the table near the window. He had a soft leather briefcase in front of him, and a coffee cup he hadn't touched. I'd met him twice before, Both times at the store when he came to meet with Grandpa about something I wasn't part of. He was the kind of attorney who didn't make small talk and didn't smile unless there was a specific reason to. Nobody explained why he was there. My mother just said he'd been a good friend to the family and wanted to be present for the dinner. I sat down across from my cousin and helped myself to pot roast and told myself it didn't mean anything. The dinner was fine. Stories about Grandpa. A few tears. Curtis told a story about going fishing with him that I was pretty sure was partly invented. But it made my aunt laugh, so I didn't say anything. Then my father tapped his fork against his glass. The table went quiet. Dad stood up. He looked at Curtis first, which told me everything before he said a word. "Your grandfather built something special," he said. "And he would have wanted it to stay in this family in good hands." He paused. "Curtis, you've got the drive and the vision for this. Your grandfather believed in you, and your mother and I believe in you." Curtis accepted the compliment with the ease of someone who had been expecting it. He nodded, set down his fork, said something about being honored and about how he planned to take the business to the next level. My mother reached over and squeezed his hand. I looked at my plate, and then I heard a chair push back from the table. Mr. Sheehan stood up. He didn't do it dramatically. He just stood up the way a man does when he has something to say and has already decided to say it. My father frowned. "Harold, everything okay?" "There's one more matter," Mr. Sheehan said. His voice was even and unhurried. "Before this conversation continues, I need to read something into the record. This was your father's specific instruction." He opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. The seal was wax. Dark blue wax, and pressed into it was the letter H, Grandpa's initial. He set it on the table. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at Curtis. Curtis looked at the envelope like it had appeared from nowhere. Mr. Sheehan broke the seal and unfolded 2 pages of paper. The handwriting on them was Grandpa's. I recognized it immediately, that tight, careful cursive he'd used his entire life on inventory notes and birthday cards. Mr. Sheehan read aloud. "If you're hearing this, then I'm gone and the family is together. Which means it's time to say what I didn't say while I was living." The table was completely still. For most of my life, I ran this business on instinct and stubbornness. I was lucky. But luck runs out, and businesses that last beyond one generation last because someone with real discipline takes over. Not because of a name, and not because of a personality. Curtis shifted into his seat. I spent the last several years watching everyone at this table. I watched how they handled responsibility, how they handled money, and how they handled things that went wrong when nobody was paying attention. I made my decision based on what I saw. Mr. Sheehan paused. He looked up once, briefly, then looked back down at the pages. The business, the building, the accounts, and the operating authority of Harmon's Hardware are to pass to my granddaughter, Cassie. Nobody moved. My father said, "What?" Mr. Sheehan continued reading without looking up. "I have worked with Harold Sheehan to structure this properly. The transfer documents were filed 18 months ago. The business succession plan is already in place. Cassie does not need anyone's approval to assume this role. She has already been doing the work." I don't know what my face looked like in that moment. I know my hands were flat on the table, and I was very focused on keeping them still. My mother started to say something and stopped. Curtis leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he said, quietly, "This has to be a mistake." Mr. Sheehan lowered the pages and looked at him directly. "It is not a mistake. The documents were executed in full compliance with Ohio's succession law. The filing predates your grandfather's illness by more than a year. There is no ambiguity." Curtis looked at my father. My father looked at me. It was the first time all evening that anyone at that table had really looked at me. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what I expected. I thought if something like this ever happened, I'd feel vindicated. Triumphant, maybe. I didn't. What I felt was something quieter and heavier. I felt the weight of 11 years. I felt all the Tuesday mornings in waiting rooms, and all the spreadsheets on Sunday evenings, And all the times I'd answered the phone at 7 a.m. because a vendor had a question, and there was nobody else. And underneath all of that, I felt something that took me a moment to name. I felt seen. The table had broken into quiet, overlapping conversations that my mother was trying to hold together. Curtis pushed back his chair and walked out to the back porch. My father followed him after a minute. I could see them through the sliding glass door, not yelling, just standing close together and talking in low voices with their arms crossed. Mr. Sheehan came around the table and set a folder in front of me. Business transfer documents. Operating account access. A letter from the store's insurance carrier. Everything organized and tabbed. Your grandfather was thorough, he said. He always was, I said. He nodded once, gathered his briefcase, and said goodnight to my mother on his way out. I sat at that dinner table for a while after he left. My aunt was crying softly. My cousin was on her phone. My mother was cleaning up dishes with a focused, deliberate energy that I knew meant she was processing something she didn't have words for yet. Eventually, the back door slid open. Curtis came back inside. He looked tired. He sat down across from me, in the seat he'd been in all evening, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Did you know?" I shook my head. "Not until tonight." He nodded slowly. He picked up his fork and then set it down again. "I thought I was going to run that store." "I know," I said. There wasn't much else to say. Curtis had spent years assuming something was his without doing the work to earn it, and Grandpa, quietly, carefully, without ever making a scene, had decided differently. That wasn't my choice. It wasn't my doing. It was just what the truth looked like when it finally came out. I want to say Curtis and I talked through everything that night and walked away closer. That's not what happened. He left before dessert, and we didn't speak for about 6 weeks. That part was hard. We'd grown up together. Even with all the favoritism, even with all the ways the family's attention had always skewed toward him. He was still my brother. But here's what I've learned about family dynamics and money and inheritance. The resentment that surfaces in those moments was almost never created in those moments. It had been building for years. The dinner was just when it finally had a form. What I did in those 6 weeks was go to the store. I showed up on a Monday morning and introduced myself to the staff the way Grandpa would have wanted. Not as the new owner, but as someone who intended to learn and to listen. A few of them had worked there longer than I had. I asked them what was working and what wasn't, and I took notes. I went through the books the way I always had, but this time with the understanding that the decisions were mine to make. The building needed a new roof. I'd known that for 2 years and kept noting it in the quarterly reports. I got 3 bids and scheduled the work. One of the vendors we'd been using for power tools had been quietly inflating shipping costs. I renegotiated the contract and switched 2 product lines to a competitor. It took about a month. I hired a part-time bookkeeper, so the financial records would have a second set of eyes. None of it was dramatic. It was just the work. My mother called me one evening about a month after the dinner. She was quiet on the phone in a way she wasn't usually quiet. She asked me how the store was going, and I told her. She asked if I was sleeping okay, and I told her that too. Then she said, "Your grandfather always talked about you, you know." At the end, he said you had the steadiest hands of anyone in the family. I didn't know what to do with that, so I just thanked her. She said, "I think we didn't always see that," I said. "I know. I'm sorry for that, Cassie." It wasn't a grand apology. It didn't undo 11 years of being the daughter who was expected to be grateful for whatever was left over. But it was real, and that mattered more to me than I expected it to. Curtis reached out eventually. He texted first, just a short message, asking if I wanted to get coffee. We met at a diner near the old neighborhood on a Saturday morning, and it was awkward for the first 20 minutes. He talked about a job opportunity he was looking at in Columbus. I told him about the roof. He made a joke about how Grandpa always said the roof was fine, and we both laughed. Before we left, he said, "I want you to know I don't blame you." I told him I didn't blame him either. Because I didn't. The store is doing well. We've added a tool rental section. something Grandpa and I had discussed for years, but never quite got around to. In the first 3 months, it brought in enough additional revenue to cover its own overhead and then some. The longtime employees are still there. One of them, a man who'd worked the floor for 22 years, told me recently that the store felt the same as it always had, which I took as the highest possible compliment. Grandpa Raymond's photo is still on the wall near the register. It's been there for as long as I can remember. He's standing in front of the original storefront in 1981, squinting into the sun, looking like he's already thinking about what comes next. I walk past it every morning when I unlock the front door. Some days I still hear his voice. "Good eye, Cassie. Good eye." He didn't leave the business to the grandchild who wanted it most. He left it to the one who had already been taking care of it.